Before I begin, I was going to take my watch off so I can keep a sense of time, because there's a story told about a child who is visiting a congregation and asking a parent, what does this mean, what does that mean? And finally, when the clergy puts the watch down, they say, what does that mean? The parent says, absolutely nothing. So think about that a minute. Anyways, I want to start with noting that within Judaism there are many, many views. And I'm going to do my best to present what it is that the various strands of Judaism have in common on issues of reproductive rights and abortion. And I wanted to mention one other thing, that when I was ordained 30 years ago, in our movement, already 40% of my classmates were women, and I think we often take for granted certain views and ideas that I realize a lot of people don't take for granted in terms of how we have functioned and how quickly women have risen to positions of authority within our movement that hasn't happened in other places. I will talk a little bit about the different movements. I come from the more liberal branch of Judaism, the Reform movement, and yet what I'm going to say is going to be primarily across the board in many different ways. I think the first thing we want to talk about is, just in general, how women are viewed in traditional sense in the Bible is definitely, when you talk about the phrase in Genesis, that Adam's helpmate is an ezer kenegdo, somebody who could stand right next to him, right equal with him, challenge him, teach him, he could learn from that. Certainly it was important to have somebody who could be his equal, and that is something that's very important. It's respect for all human beings, and obviously all human beings include women. So that's should be a given and shouldn't even have to be discussed. What I do want to talk about is the issue that has been brought up a few times, but to use a little bit of a biblical text. I'm always amazed when people say, don't you read the Bible, and how it tells you that abortion is a sin and wrong, and I understand that some can interpret and understand that, but I can read the text and see it very differently. And so I thought I would just maybe take one example to show you why we have to be careful and not say there's only one way to read the text. It's actually in Exodus chapter 21 that there is a discussion of many different cases that happen, civil situations, people, and conflicts. And one arises, starting with verse 22 through 25. If two men strive together and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart, and yet no harm follow, he shall surely be fined according to the woman's husband, shall be determined as the right amount, and he shall pay as determined. But if any harm occurs to the woman, then the punishment shall be given. And what follows is a phrase we hear often, life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And if you read that text, it clearly is saying that the punishment for the death of the unborn fetus is not a capital crime. The text is saying that there is something about it that's a horrible situation. It's not promoting it in this particular case, but it is saying it is not the same as life. And that brings up an issue, and I don't want to, my wife would say, how come you're going to tell a joke? I'm going to warn you. But the reality is, when we talk about this discussion does come down to the question of when does life begin? And once there was a panel of 3 people discussing when life begins, and one says it begins at conception, second said, when there's a viable fetus. They turn to the rabbi and they say, when does life begin? He says, when the mortgage is paid and the kids are out of college. You guys can appreciate that. The reality is that while we all have different definitions, and it's been brought up a few times in this panel, when does life begin? The formal Jewish definition across the board is that life begins at birth. So if somebody determines that abortion is illegal across the board under any circumstance, they have, in a sense, violated my religious rights. And I think that's one of the areas we have to look at with regard to that. I've never heard that discussion come up in courts in one form or another, but it's something that should be looked at. The life of the mother always takes precedence over the life of the potential life, but not the actual life of the fetus. Another issue is that within Judaism, we don't have the concept of original sin. A child is born pure, that marital relations are a blessing, and that they should be done for pleasure as well as for procreation of having children. So birth control is in no way seen as a sin of stopping what couples should enjoy among themselves. Now, obviously, the traditional understanding of that is within the context of marriage, but it certainly says that there are many reasons for people to have sexual relations, and that having children is only one of them, and that there's a pleasure within that. Now, various branches of Judaism will differ. Most will say, though, however, it is in the context of a family setting in most cases. I'm not naive, but I'm just telling you what the tradition will present with regard to that. Some of the different movements will encourage individuals to consult with their clergy about everything. None of them say, see what the national law says. They say, talk to your clergy about that so that you are working within your faith and your community. And within Judaism, the more traditional communities might have a different answer than the more liberal, but I'm going to give you one example, which was how we come together within that. So to summarize some of these ideas, marital relations are a blessing. There's no concept of original sin, so birth control is certainly something that is allowed within Judaism and is seen as appropriate in many different cases. Life begins at birth. Abortion has never been promoted, but is allowed in certain cases, and that's something that an individual has to decide. I'll give you one example, perhaps another one if it comes up, but there is a genetic disease that affects Jews of East European background. Tay-Sachs is the better known. There's also another Gaucher disease. These are diseases, Tay-Sachs in particular, where most cases it's a recessive gene. If both parents are carrying the gene, they have a 1 in 4 chance of having a child who will be born normal, and within a year, just nerve degeneration starts. It's a horrible, horrible thing for the parents to go through and to see, that child is not going to live beyond the age of maybe 3 or 4 at the most, if that long. And it's a real trauma for these couples. Well, the rabbis weigh that against the whole concept of you should be fruitful and multiply. And they basically say, now that we have technology that can tell us beforehand if you have a Tay-Sachs child, should the parent have the right to abort that child and try again? And the response is, in the liberal community, yes, that would be a decision that the parents could make if that's what they see. More traditional community will say, talk to your rabbi about it, but if that would stop you from having more children, it very well may be acceptable. So even the most orthodox will say this is a situation where, in order to have more children and populate the world, that if this is going to cause you a trauma and never have a child again, then maybe you should do this. They don't say absolutely yes, but they'll say it certainly is allowable in that situation. The last thing that I want to really mention is that this is a religious issue, and it's been brought up again a few times. As our differences would show, it's not a legal issue as much as a religious issue. One should follow their own traditions' guidelines, the guidelines of a community they've chosen to be part of, not try to legislate their views on others whose views might be different. I think ultimately it is worthwhile to find supportive clergy to talk to. And I stress the idea of somebody who's supportive, somebody who's not preaching to you, although we are supposed to do that at certain times, but there's also times we're supposed to be listening and being supportive, and to advise people on matters, and also to help people deal with their families when necessary, because that's another element that can be very harsh, and do what we can to keep the families closer together. So I'm just going to share that at this point, and if there's questions later, I certainly can respond to those.